Hello and welcome. My name's Chris Cann with Mining Journal, and I'm here with John Mulligan, the Climate Change Lead and Market Relations Director at the World Gold Council. This is the final interview in a three-part series in our climate program, where we're looking at the upcoming COP26 meeting and its implications for the mining industry. Hi, John.
Hi, Chris.
Previous interviews, we've talked about the key themes that are likely to come up being more focus on targets, a ramping up of actual strategy, and seeing corporates in particular put some of those pieces of the puzzle together in terms of how they're going to hit those targets. What's not on the agenda that you think should be there or could be there?
Well, I think several of the key aspects of the discussion in terms of what a decarbonised economy means looking forward, they're on the agenda, but they're not being given the priority, or they haven't been as the subjects haven't been as mature, shall we say, in the programme as they are likely to be soon. And what I mean by that is issues such as the just transition, the idea of what decarbonising the global economy means for emerging markets and developing economies. I think some of the detailed impacts on the ground of resilience, what it means to build resilience against physical impacts. I think all of those things have been placed in the agenda. I just don't think they've been given the priority or the space because of this primary focus on net zero targets and reinvigorating the decarbonisation pathways, particularly of countries. I think corporates are, in some ways, the investment community has been quite advanced in this discussion. But I think once we get past, if we can, that reinvigorating, refreshing target discussion, then we can move on to these issues of resilience and the transition as it applies to emerging economies, developing nations.
Do you think that's right for where we are at the moment in terms of the broader discussion and the mining industry in particular? Do you think it's right to focus on this clear area at the moment that is around targeting and getting everyone onto the same page for those strategies?
I think we're playing catch up regarding targets. I mean, the pledges at Paris were made, but actions weren't taken.
Right.
And so everybody is looking again at those pledges and saying, well, actually, were they fit for purpose, given what we know now, given that the climate science is crystal clear? Do we need to restate those commitments? But also, do we need to really and urgently implement, define what the implementation plans are? And the answer to that question is yes. So that's undoubtedly been a key focus. And we've got to remember we're already late in doing so.
Okay. And some of the priorities that you're mentioning there that are probably slightly longer term, and I mean slightly, they'll probably be on the agenda, I expect, for COP27. What are some of the other things that people who have got those 2050 net zero targets in mind, what are some of the things that you would be expecting them to be pushing at this meeting in November?
Well, first of all, just to go back to the question of the next COP, COP27, that's an African-hosted COP. And so the issues I mentioned about resilience and the impact on developing economies and local economies and communities, I think that will take centre stage far more than this COP.
Okay.
And the second point of your question?
Second point of the question was around 2050 targets.
2050
and
targets.
What
Thanks.
People who are prioritising those would want to have on the agenda.
Sure. So there's been a focus on the commitment to net zero in 2050 and committing to a target, but we're already getting demands, frankly, for a clarity on action plans and specifically on intermediate targets. 2050 is a long way away for a lot of people. It seems a long way away. And therefore, the question is, okay, well, what are you doing that we can measure now or that we can measure within the next few years to establish that we are on the right pathway? So 2030 actually is quite a milestone for a lot of people. And I think you need to have fairly detailed, concrete plans in terms of decarbonisation to 2030 be in place quite soon. And that's why the disclosure reporting process is important, because it allows people to see your plan and it allows people to measure your progress against it.
Okay. What are some of the things that people who are interested in some of the outcomes and want to see progress and some transparency for the mining sector in terms of 2050 targets? What will those people be looking for? Is it just around having a better idea about reporting standards and those pathways, or are there things such as R&D spend commitments on technologies that will be necessary for net zero down the track?
It's a really good question, and I think it goes back to, it almost mirrors my previous point. Actually, some of the plans in terms of what are you implementing on the ground will start to allow mining companies, hopefully, to articulate better their positive impacts on the ground. So suddenly, if you're bringing clean energy to your mine in a remote location, you may also be bringing clean energy to the local economy. And that's a very important aspect. It ties in with the discussions around the just transition, but it's often not yet discussed. And I think some gold mining companies haven't yet considered their broader impacts. I think that will change to some extent the discussion. And I think gold mining companies and mining companies generally need to think of the development impacts of their action to decarbonize. So yes, 2050 is important. As I say, probably more important is that intermediate plan. And then when you look at that plan, what in it might have broader development impacts or impacts that will allow us to move towards not only a net zero economy, but a sustainable economy.
It's really interesting, the point about that broader impact and some miners not fully thinking it through. One of the conversations we often have with the mining industry leadership is the fact that the industry doesn't communicate that point very well. I hadn't actually realized that some people weren't actually aware of these impacts. I mean, from a World Gold Council perspective, what do the conversations look like among the membership in terms of getting some of these really positive influences around transition out to broader stakeholder groups?
So I think, and it depends obviously on which member company you're talking to. Some of them are very, shall we say, mature in understanding not only where they are in terms of decarbonisation pathways, but have started to think about the introduction of mini grids and microgrids to local communities. But a lot haven't. A lot are basically starting on the journey to saying, okay, we know we need to decarbonise typically our electricity generation on site. How do we do that? And then when you say to them, well, the process by which you do that may have broader impacts, they say, yes, they acknowledge it, yes, they understand it. They've not yet thought of communicating it. And I see that as a potential opportunity for the gold mining sector to, frankly, potentially broaden its investor base and also communicate its value better to its stakeholder groups.
Okay, and John, just finally, attitudes in mining are traditionally short-term, often looking at the next quarter. Is that changing sufficiently and at a sufficient pace to seriously look at 2050 targets and some of the things that we do need to be doing now as a sector to make some of those things happen?
Yeah, this is an interesting one because mining, by definition, is a long-term business. So the question is it mining or is it the investors that are short-term? And I think that's an really important point. I think short-termism is undoubtedly an enemy of progress on climate change. We have to look forward to long-term paths and trajectories. So you need long-term management thinking, you need long-term strategy. And I think mining actually should be relatively suited to that. The amount of, the capital expenditure to create a project with a relatively long shelf life is actually well aligned to thinking about climate. If you build the climate thinking in and embed it in your core strategies. And I think the investor thinking, definitely needs to be longer term.
Okay. John Mulligan, thanks very much for your time.
Thanks, Chris.